Cassidy, you are introducing today's speakers, my understanding.
That's correct. And I think we have our speaker slide as well. So we'll take 1 second to let that get up there. We are very, very happy to welcome Paul Cada to our Rotary meeting today. He's the Wildland Program Manager for Vail Fire and Emergency Services. That means he's responsible for the fire department and town's response to wildland fires. He also deals with prevention, mitigation, response, and communication issues that come up. So it's a really, really big job. And I know so many of us are affected by wildfire. In fact, I see Ken Dubach here, whose home was burned down in the last fire in Boulder just a few months ago. So we really have a lot to hear from Paul, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me share my screen with you here real quick. All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity and reaching out. This is a topic that is very important to me. I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to give a little bit of behind the scenes in wildland firefighting, and I'll focus a lot here on suppression. But as Cassidy pointed out, I do have job responsibilities kind of across the board in wildland firefighting. So a little bit about me. I've been a wildland firefighter career-wise for about 14 years. I am just one of approximately 20 or 25,000 wildland firefighters that fight fires all across the U.S. each year. I have a background in natural resource management from Colorado State University. And, I think it's really important to be able to share with you guys kind of some of the behind the scenes. Sometimes wildland fire can seem kind of like a mystery. I know a lot of times we don't like to talk exactly about what we do, but I think there's some really good opportunities here. But before I launch into kind of what it looks like today, I think it's important to understand where wildland firefighting has come from in the United States. So really, wildland firefighting is old as the federal land management agencies. Back in 1905, when the U.S. Forest Service was first founded as a federal agency, one of the core missions was wildland firefighting. This is a picture from 2010 Big Burn up in Idaho. And that was a really eye-opening experience for a very young organization. It was very underfunded, very understaffed. And the fire really was of epic proportions. And even before the Big Burn, we had seen very massive wildfires, particularly in the state of Wisconsin with the Peshtigo fire, which for those history folks also occurred in the same timing as the Great Chicago Fire, and really made some pretty lasting impressions in natural resources in the state of Wisconsin. During the period between 1910 and World War II, the Forest Service continued to view wildland fire as the greatest threat to the natural resources which they were tasked with managing and protecting. Actually, during World War II, the Japanese were trying to figure out how to weaponize wildland fire and sending incendiary balloons across the Pacific to try to start wildland fires all along the Pacific coast. Fortunately, there was not any large amount of weaponization of wildland fire. But as you can see from this poster, the U.S. government was pretty heavily focused during World War II on making sure that we were very careful to protect our natural resources. Moving forward into the 1970s and 80s, wildland fire started to really increase in size and in complexity. This fire right here was from, or this picture right here is from the 1988 Yellowstone fires. And, you know, that was an incredibly important and, you know, eye-opening experience for that area. During the summer of 1988, 42 fires burned together approximately 36% of the park, or nearly 800,000 acres. If you go to Yellowstone today, you can see kind of the natural recovery that's occurred within the park. But really, at that time, that was fire on an unprecedented scale. As we move even forward, you know, into, you know, more contemporary times, 1991, the Oakland Hills fire in Oakland, California. This was the first major conflagration or house-to-house spreading of wildfire in really an urban area, and this really kind of pointed to this new era that unfortunately we're seeing continue on a greater and greater scale. And so, you know, as this all evolves, you know, that pushes us forward into, you know, this year. I don't think anybody here or within the state of Colorado would argue that 2020 was a pretty exceptional wildfire year. Unfortunately, not for a lot of great reasons. You know, this was a map during kind of the height of, you know, the fall fire season here. You know, at this point, there was fires going all over north central Colorado. The Calwood fire, which was impacting you folks down there in Boulder County. At that time, I was on the Cameron Peak fire, up trying to help protect houses in the Big Thompson Canyon. At the same time, East Troublesome fire made the largest single run in Colorado history. And, you know, really at that time, there was also a bunch of smaller fires that were not quite making the CNN headlines. So, you know, when I get this question a lot, so who do you work for? You know, wildland firefighters are really employed by, you know, this is really underrepresents the organizations out there. You know, wildland firefighters work for federal, state, tribal government, local government. One that is significantly under-recognized is the contributions that our contractors make. There is a huge contract world within wildland firefighting, and they provide a very critical resource. You know, within nearly every fire department within the state of Colorado, everybody has a role in wildland firefighting. And, you know, when fires occur, everybody plays together in the sandbox. When we look at how do we fight wildland fires, I think it's important to think about it as a system of systems. So that system is really kind of the overarching system. There is what we call the National Wildfire Coordinating Group. And this is a group that sets the standards for training, for types of apparatus, for really everything that we do at a national scale. Because as I'll explain here in a second, everything starts small. But when we start getting these very large fires, we will have firefighters from literally all over the country and sometimes internationally. And so it's important that we speak the same language, that we have similar training, and we utilize similar tactics. So NWCG, and the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, is absolutely critical. This map here kind of shows how the country is broken down into what we call our response regions. So here in Colorado, we're part of the Rocky Mountain region. The Rocky Mountain region covers all of Colorado, most of Wyoming, all of Nebraska, Kansas, and a good part of South Dakota. So you can see it's a pretty big area. So as I mentioned, all fires start small. All fires start literally with a single spark and, you know, grow from there. Sometimes, and actually in most cases, fires are contained very small. On average, you know, it's estimated that there's approximately 60,000 wildland fires across the United States. I would actually say that that's probably an underestimation. Of those 60,000 fires, 98% of them end up being relatively small, unnotable. Nobody really pays attention to them other than the responders that were there. So overall, I would say as a wildland fire community, we're pretty good. We can stop 98% of fires before they're relatively noticeable. But the 2% of the fires are really what catch the news. So how does a fire that grows rapidly and it exceeds the capability of the local responders? So for instance, if we have a small fire starts in Vail, we're going to send our local fire department, the Forest Service engines that are stationed nearby, and we're going to try to manage the fire. If that exceeds our capabilities, we can push that up to the Rocky Mountain region to say, hey, can you please send me firefighters? And we utilize a term called closest force, which is we want the closest people that are capable and qualified. So we're going to get firefighters first from within Colorado and then within the region. So we might start seeing firefighters from Nebraska or Kansas or Wyoming. If we don't have available resources because of other fires going on within that region, all of these regions are connected through what's called the National Interagency Fire Center, which determines who gets what resources, especially as we start getting towards the peak of the fire season where we have a lot of fires going on across the nation. We can fairly rapidly run out of available resources. And so the job of the National Interagency Fire Center is to prioritize fires. And the way they prioritize fires is based on what is the threat to really to human safety and then to property. So when we have large fires like we saw in Colorado in 2020, at that time when Calwood and East Troublesome and Cameron Peak were all burning, those were the 3 top priority fires in the nation. So they were getting the highest priorities of resources at a national level. The other, I think, monumental thing that's super important is how we organize. So when we talk about large fires like the Cameron Peak fire, at one point, Cameron Peak had multiple thousand firefighters. So what we do, we utilize a system called the Incident Command System to structure how everybody fits together. It's founded on the purpose that there's one person, there's one incident commander who's in charge of that fire. Their job is the overall management of all of the people, the priorities on that fire. Most of the time, the people that get the airplay on the news that get credited for all the work is the operations section. Those are the people on the ground in the air doing the work. I would argue that the other sections are equally and maybe even more so important, particularly the logistics section. And those are the fine folks that make sure that all of the people on the ground have the resources that they need to make sure we can continue on with our operations. I mentioned about scarcity of resources. So this is a map that was taken, or a clip of a map taken, I believe that was in late September. You can see all of the fires going on in the Western US. There was a few also even in Kentucky at the time. But when we start talking about if one fire may need a few thousand firefighters, then if we only have 25,000 firefighters, how do we spread out the rest of them to all of these other fires? So the folks at the National Interagency Fire Center, they have a very tough job. Realistically, at the height of the fire season, no one fire gets everything that they ask for, but they need to make sure that they prioritize that. And really, again, that's on community safety. So what tools do we use for the job? Well, fire is, at its simplest form, a pretty simple biophysical process. It needs 3 things to continue to combust. You need heat, you need fuel, and you need oxygen. Because wildland fire burns really in an outdoor environment, well, removing oxygen is not really an option. So we really focus on two things. How do we get rid of heat, and how do we separate fuel from that fire? Well, we got a bunch of different tools in the toolboxes, and we use everything from high tech to incredibly low tech systems to do that. On here we have aircraft. This is probably what most people are familiar with, especially on big fires. This is definitely what catches the news's eye. Aircraft is really, really helpful. It can drop either retardant, which is the pink stuff on the left, or water, which is coming from the helicopter on the right. Both of those do a job of removing heat from that fire. We also use heavy equipment, bulldozers, harvesters, skidders. A lot of forestry and construction equipment gets utilized out on the fire line. Their job is literally to create a line, so they're separating where the fire is burning from the fuel that is not burning. Heavy equipment can do really good work, can cover a lot of ground quickly. It's a relatively heavy-handed approach, and there are areas, particularly in our mountainous environment, where heavy equipment just doesn't work very well. So then it comes down to those on the ground. We have a lot of ground-based resources. This is a picture of the El Carrizo hotshots. We utilize a lot of hand crews, and their job is very similar to heavy equipment, to separate fuel from fire, and we can utilize them in a lot of different capacities. And then lastly, there's kind of our water handling equipment. So here's a picture of one of our wildland apparatus. This is a Type 6 engine, kind of the small guys. They're fairly nimble, don't carry a ton of water on them, but the job of the water handling equipment is to get water from its source out to the fire line. And we can utilize a lot of different methods to do that. Another question that I get a lot is, boy, your job seems kind of dangerous. Is it safe? Well, if you look at the Merriam-Webster's definition of safe, it's free from harm or risk. And I think if you look at it at a simple answer like that, I would say, no, this job is not safe. There is definitely a lot of inherent risk to wildland fire. In fact, we look at safety literally in everything that we do. We look at safety from a risk management perspective. So we are evaluating the operations that we do at the risk versus gain. And risk management is incorporated through all of the training that we incorporate, all of the operations that we do. But the reality is we are not able to eliminate all risk. There is a significant amount of risk in wildland firefighting. And if you ask the normal, wildland firefighter that steps off of an engine or on a crew, they'd say, it's not that much. But I think if you compare that to kind of the normal everyday perspective of what is safe, there is a lot of risk associated with this. Here on the screen is kind of a picture of a normal personal protective equipment ensemble of a wildland firefighter. So what you see there is some very basic stuff from head to toe: hard hat, safety glasses, fire resistant shirt and pants, sturdy boots for working in an outdoor rugged environment. In the US, wildland firefighters typically carry a pack, and depending on what their assigned job is, that pack may be anywhere from 25 to 50 pounds. If their job is chainsaw, it can be substantially heavier than that. All of the PPE is designed to be fire retardant. It provides relatively minimal thermal protection to the firefighter. So unlike structure fire PPE, where that provides a lot of protection against the heat, the wildland firefighters ensemble is relatively minimal on that, because they're working in a hot environment. They need to also be able to sweat and let that heat go from their body. they're wearing this PPE for 16 hours a day for extended tours of time. So having lightweight, durable PPE is really, really important. Another really critical piece of equipment that's carried in the bottom of that pack is a fire shelter. And the intention of that is it's a last ditch piece of safety equipment where if that firefighter is being overrun by fire, they may be able to safely crawl underneath there and survive the fire as it overcomes them. Unfortunately, it is not a 100% solution. And so we really teach our safety training around fight fire as though you don't have it, because it is not a 100% solution. The other thing to note is that there is no respiratory protection. So I get a lot of questions about, well, you know, smoke in the community is bad enough, isn't it horrible on the fire line? And I think there's a growing recognition of the potential danger of wildland smoke to the wildland firefighters. So just like in structure firefighting, there is greater emphasis put on respiratory protection for the firefighters. However, there's still some time before any real useful protection, I think, is developed and utilized by firefighters on the ground. In terms of what we do on the ground, so if you troll the social media of wildland firefighters, a lot of times you see photos like this. It's, you know, everybody likes to show the glory part of their job. They're out there, they're having fun. These firefighters are engaged in operations where they're actually burning out fuel between a road and where the existing fire is. This is the really exciting part of the job. I will definitely tell you that's about 2% of the job. A lot of wildland fire is a lot less exciting than that. As these pictures show, there is a lot of, we like to call it hurry up and wait. Everybody rushes to the fire, but then there is a lot of time making sure that resources are in the right places, that plans are in place, and that we can safely engage in fire. So there sometimes is a lot of sitting around watching, being prepared. There's also a lot of just really small, mundane stuff. When fire burns, particularly for long periods of time, it gets deep into roots, into logs. There is just a lot of really just dirty physical work of, you know, trying to mop up, as we call it, or put out every last little bit of heat of that really deep-seated fire. So in a given season, depending on the agency that the firefighter works for, the time that they spend on a fire may be big. A lot of times it's a relatively small total percentage of the job. So what do? Our firefighters, our wildland firefighters, for instance, probably spend less than 20% of their overall season on an actual wildland fire. So what do we do for the other 80% of that? Well, we have our daily operations. A big part of our program and many programs across the country is making sure that our communities are prepared. We do things like we have a community chipper program. So our wildland firefighters are responsible for running that community chipper program. We do a lot of fuels reduction. So here's a picture from one of the projects that we have going on in Westvale, where you can see we've cut down, in this case, these were a lot of dead lodgepole pine from the mountain pine beetle, stacked them up into piles. And then in the wintertime, when we have some snow on the ground, we burn that fuel, eliminating that. So taking care of that fire, we're fighting the fire before that wildland fire ever actually gets to our fuel treatment. The other thing that we do a lot of is training. If all we rely on is being the day of the fire, that we're going to have all the tools that we need, we're going to fall flat on our face. So we spend a lot of time practicing as we play. Another question that I get is, well, how do people even get into wildland firefighting? Wildland firefighting is, I guess I would call it a somewhat specialty area. Most wildland firefighters start in some kind of seasonal capacity, whether it's working for the federal land agencies like the BLM or Forest Service, working for states or local government, or like I said, the contractor area hires a lot of wildland firefighters. Our candidates tend to be relatively young and fit individuals that are outdoor oriented. The basic training that is required to become a wildland firefighter is relatively minimal. It's a 40-hour course. And then there is a fair amount of ongoing training that occurs once you're hired by an organization. Our operations require a high strenuous level of physical exertion. The other part of the kind of minimum requirements for operational firefighters is what we call the PAC test. So every year, every wildland firefighter in the US has to pass the PAC test, which is a 3-mile walk carrying a 45-pound pack in 45 minutes or less. That is what's been established as the minimum level of physical fitness for any of the firefighters that are out there on the line. I would say in our mountainous terrain, that's actually a somewhat underestimation of the physical needs of the job. We look at our positions as occupational athletes. So therefore, one of the parts of our daily operations is all of our firefighters are required to do at least 1 hour of physical training. And that typically includes doing a lot of hiking, running, carrying heavy weights. It's not uncommon, particularly for our sawyers, to be carrying upwards of 50 or 60 pounds on their back between the chainsaw and their pack. So it is absolutely critical that our folks are in top physical shape. And so then, one last thing I wanted to hit on is, what are the trends for the future? I get this question very frequently. So here's kind of a summary of acres burned, which is just one way that we can look at wildland fires. So since 1985, the average acres burned has increased fairly significantly. So back in 1985, on average, we were burning about 2 million acres a year. Right now, on average, we're probably closer to 6.5 million, with some years at or exceeding 10 million acres a year. So there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the number of acres burned, the risk to our communities is only increasing. We have a changing fire environment. We have changing weather environments, and it is only a growing problem. What that means is that we need more involvement with our communities. We need more folks to step up and become wildland firefighters. And, I look at it as I have absolutely no doubt that I have plenty of job security for the rest of my career. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have a whole bunch of good questions, so prepare yourself, Paul, okay? So
Absolutely.
The first one up is John Rieger. John.
Well, Paul, thank you for taking the time today, and thank you for your commitment to the work. And we wish you a long and safe career, indeed. Your expertise, of course, is on the fighting of the fire. There's debate over how do we get control of this ever-increasing challenge that we face within our country. And some have advocated that, we just got to manage the fuel load better, and we got to let some of the stuff and Mother Nature take its course and let it burn. Protect structures and people, of course, and otherwise let it burn. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there is a lot of different ways that I think we need to attack this issue. we have, as I mentioned, a changed fuel environment. So what's out there in the woods has increased exponentially since really, call it, European settlement of our area. And a lot of that is from the policies that we've had. The ecology of our environment is adapted to wildland fire, but each ecosystem, so look at ponderosa pine or lodgepole pine, they each have different kind of adaptations. And some of the challenges in for instance, just let it burn in ponderosa pine is that ponderosa pine is ecologically evolved with low intensity fire, but because of our changed fuel load, if you just let it burn, it will burn at very high intensity right now. And what that does is that puts ecology out of whack, and you end up with large fire scars, for instance, like the Hayman fire from 2002, where that was almost all in ponderosa pine. And if you go into that burn scar today, nearly no trees are growing there. Even replanting has been fairly minimally successful. And so with our extremely changed fuel environment, particularly in ecosystems like ponderosa pine, letting it just burn may not be the best sole way to work ourselves out of the situation. So there is no silver bullet to this. Really, it's a combination of everything.
Great. Thank you very much. Merrill Glustrom, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Mike. And thanks for speaking to our club, Paul. Appreciate it. Tammy Angel, who's acting regional forester, said, and I quote, "The fire issue is the whole West. This is about a combination of climate change, drought, insects, disease, and the fact that we're suppressing fires for a century, adding fuel loads onto the ecosystems. And given that more and more people are building on the wildland urban interface. So given all of that, it's interesting that Angel mentions climate change first, since it impacts all the other causes. So solving the fire issue is a daunting challenge. And as you mentioned, there's no silver bullet. But given the ubiquity, complexity, and expense, and all the people living in this area now that we call the forest, do you see a way forward?
I absolutely do see a way forward. I have really built my career around kind of all of what you just mentioned. Really the wildland problem is a very complex and wicked issue. There is no single solution. There is no one agency that has responsibility for all of this. This is really a shared problem. And I am very hopeful that there is greater interest, greater awareness at every level, from individual homeowners all the way up to the U.S. Capitol. There has been a lot of very positive movement. However, the size of this challenge is enormous. And, so I think it's important to look at it at a variety of different levels in judging success. And, I work at a lot of different scales, from, working with individual property owners on up to, I'm very active in a number of groups that work at both the state and national level. And, every step that we take towards solving this problem is a positive step in my mind. And so, yes, we need more funding, we need more people, we need changes in policy. When you look at it, it can be incredibly daunting, but there are a lot of people stepping up and making some very positive changes.
Great. Thank you very much for that answer. And good question, Merrill. Lynn, you've got a question.
Hi, Paul, and thanks. Your efforts are just over the top. You and your colleagues that are out there fighting fires. It's just incredible. But my question is, there's a tinderbox out there across the West, as you say, and other places that are suffering drought. Is there a forensic involved? Are people, bad guys, going out and starting fires? And if there are, how do you find them out? And Is that a significant part of your efforts?
That's a great question. So, you know, fortunately, there's not a bunch of bad guys out there, you know, intentionally trying to cause harm. That's you know, the good news. So about 80% of wildland fires are started by some kind of human cause. So we have about 20% of all fires that are started mostly by lightning, natural causes. Less than 5% of the overall fires are intentionally caused human fires. So, you know, what we call arson fires. So really, you know, when you look at it, about 75% of, you know, the wildland fires that are out there are caused either by, you know, negligence of, you know, say somebody for, you know, not putting out a campfire correctly, or other things like equipment failures on power lines, things like that, which are not intentional. All wildland fires do get investigated. If the initial investigation finds that they are natural cause, that's pretty much it. A lot of times it is relatively easy to identify, you know, a lightning caused fire. You know, on the arson side of things, there is active investigations that occur around arson. One of the challenges about investigating wildland fires is we may know what the cause is, the start was, but in a lot of cases, unless there's tips provided by members of the public, you know, a lot of fires start in remote areas, and it's hard to, you know, have a lot of good investigative information around, you know, who started a fire.
Great, thank you. Dick Golden, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I think you answered one of them, and I really appreciate your coming and doing this. So what you have is a full-time job. The fact that there are no forest fires going on right now doesn't mean that you're working for somebody else or just sitting around doing nothing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and that's true of all the people who work with you?
So most wildland firefighters still operate on a seasonal capacity. And, you know, that is, I think, an area that is improving, I guess, is how I would put that. You know, there is a lot of work, as you mentioned, in the off season. I absolutely do not lack for things to do on any given day. I look at my wintertime when snow covers the ground as my ability to actually look at, you know, future planning and make, you know, better preparation. During the fire season, it is very challenging to do anything other than literally to address the fire that's in front of you. And so, you know, more and more agencies, you know, at the federal level, state level, and locally are identifying the need to have wildland firefighters employed year round. And particularly along the Front Range, there is tremendous opportunity to do a lot of preparedness activity, you know, outside of the, you know, the height of the fire season. So the number of full-time year-round positions is increasing, but it is still, unfortunately, a relatively small number.
Thank you very much.
Okay, past President Darrell Brown, you have a question?
Yeah, Paul, real quick, I don't know if you can tell us what is the overall cost of an average fire? I've always wondered of the fighting of the fire, of course. Sorry.
Yeah. You know, there's a lot of things that factor in there. You know, the numbers that I've seen so far, for instance, like on Cameron Peak, you know, the cost of that is about $160 million. So, you know, that Cameron Peak burned actively for 115 days and, you know, 160 million. And I think actually the reason why nobody is putting out that number yet is that it climbs on a daily basis as bills continue to come in. You know, and so certainly the cost of firefighting, and, you know, it's not hard to find news articles about, you know, how the cost of firefighting is increasing exponentially. And there's a lot of, you know, factors associated with that. And a lot of that has to do with us moving into the wildlands. You know, we can manage fires that are in the backcountry far cheaper than we can managing fires next to people's homes. And so as we continue to push further and further into the woods, into areas that, used to just be, mostly, woods, the cost of firefighting is absolutely going to increase.
Thank you. Past President Bill Meyer.
Thank you. Paul, I want to thank you for everything you do and join with what everyone else has said. I think the whole club thanks you and your colleagues. My question is about the air assets that are used in fighting fires. They make great pictures on the evening news, but my question is, how cost effective are they? I know those planes don't operate cheaply. Would that money, in your opinion, I'm asking an opinion now, be better spent on human assets or in some other way?
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on that. The air resources are very expensive. Like all tools in the toolbox, it's necessary that we have those air resources. And particularly when we get to the height of the fire season, that's one of the most limited resources that are out there. And so priority is given on those air resources to new, smaller fires, with the idea that if we can aggressively attack small fires while they're small and keep them small, we can ultimately reduce the overall cost. Those air resources can be extremely effective if used in the right spots. But, one of the misconceptions a lot of people have is, once you drop the retardant or the water on the fire, it's out. And the reality is that every one of those drops needs to be followed up with people on the ground to actually ensure that the fire is contained and eventually put out. And so it really needs to be a both. They are, I would say, actually, as the planes and the aircraft continue to get bigger, we're actually probably getting better bang for our buck than what we are, because, we can bring more loads, more gallons of retardant in a single load. We can get those air resources into places that I never thought possible. So, there is a lot of innovation that's going on there, but they are not cheap resources.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And we're running out of time, so we probably only have time for a couple more questions. So I know there's a lot out there. I just want to kind of pre-apologize for that. The next question is Marcia. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Marcia. Or speak louder.
I'll speak louder. Thank you, Paul. This is so interesting. My question is also about the air support and the air assets. I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned that the water, coming out from the helicopter was used to reduce heat. So does this mean that it doesn't really put out the fire, but it just is allowing the firefighters less heat so they can continue to dig lines and remove brush and stuff?
That's exactly what they do. One of the challenges about dropping water from the air is that we have three-dimensional objects on the ground, particularly logs, where heat is really mostly on the underside of the log, not the top of the log. And so when you drop water from the top, all you're doing is you're cooling down the part of the fuel that water touches. So all of the heat that's up underneath that log is relatively unaffected by that heat. So it is absolutely critical with air resources that people on the ground also really work with them directly.
Okay, and our last question is going to go to Jim Radowski. Jim, you've got a number of questions. Pick your favorite one and ask that question.
Okay, it seems like over the last 150 years, the forest fire fighting has pretty much been unchanged except for the use of airplanes. Are there any really new technologies that are being considered for fighting forest fires?
Yeah, I think technology is a great question. There is new technology that's occurring. I would agree that we still utilize a lot of the same tools that were used during the 1910 Big Burn. So some technology that's coming out there. Use of drones is getting pretty big. There is a ton of new technology that's coming out in terms of what we call situational awareness, which, the big golden ticket around situational awareness is knowing where all the firefighters are on the ground, and when something bad happens, being able to get resources to them as quickly as possible. So there's huge advancements in that. I think the other big one to look at technologically wise is there are some advanced camera systems that are out there that are working on early detection. So as soon as smoke is detected in an area, smoke or heat, that notification is being made to the fire managers to check it out. And that's coming in a variety of forms, from mountaintop cameras to satellites that are orbiting, 365 days a year. So technology is definitely evolving. We could certainly, utilize more of it, but it's coming along.
If there's one thing you could do to improve forest fire fighting, what would you do?
I really see it, like I said, as a system of systems. So the biggest thing that I want to see is the improvement in cooperation, both among agencies as well as between agencies and the communities that we protect. And, that is really ultimately how we're going to solve this issue.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so Paul, I'm just wondering, I don't know what your schedule's like. We have about maybe 15 more minutes of meeting. Are you able to stick around in case other people, Jim wants to sneak his third or fourth question in there too?
Absolutely.
Yeah, or some others. Great, wonderful, Paul, because I know I have a couple questions too. So that being said, I know Marcia has something she'd like to say.
Yes, and I don't have to unmute. Yes, Paul, I am so happy that you were able to come today. We as residents, we see fires from one perspective, and you have given us a perspective, you've given us a glimpse, to behind the scenes. And it was very, very interesting. And the pictures, I really appreciated the pictures too, of the people and the equipment. And I just feel like it just gave us this great big overall view of firefighting that we had no idea about. My daughter's boyfriend is a seasonal firefighter. And for all of you out there, he is so strong. I mean, 16 hours a day, lifting, digging, carrying. He's really strong. So when you say that you pick, the strongest people in really good shape, he is definitely one of those. So thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome.
Rotary International has been working to eradicate polio for about 35 years. And the goal of getting rid of this disease is really close. And actually, we're at about 99.9% since it started. I think the first one was vaccinating children in the Philippines in 1979. So we have 2 more countries before the world is eradicated of polio. And what we'd like to do, Paul, is donate 100 cases of vaccination in your name.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, well, Marcia, thank you for responding to Paul. And Paul, that was awesome. I do want to have a shout out to you and all of the folks that served the state of Colorado and hell, the entire Western region this past year. So thank you very much. And thank you for your service.
So let me start off with Charlotte's question because she had to leave, and then we'll go right on to some of the others that had questions. I know Randy Butler did, and Jim Radofsky and some others. So Charlotte asked, Paul, what role do satellites and drone technologies play in fire mapping and early detection?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's a variety of different tools that are emerging between mountaintop cameras and satellites that are using some pretty amazing new technology to detect those, those fires, which allows people to, get that earlier. They're replacing the old system of having people in towers on mountaintops searching for smoke. So that is definitely the way of the future. So drones, besides detection stuff, we also utilize drones for also looking at access into fires or being able to get a bird's eye view without having to use something like a helicopter. Kind of the newest technology that we're using is actually utilizing drones to start beneficial fires such as backfire, which also reduces the need for us to utilize helicopters and put people at risk in helicopters. So a bunch of new technology emerging from that side.
Okay, great. Thank you. Randy Butler, would you mind unmuting yourself and asking your question? You have a couple questions, I think. So go ahead and the floor is yours, sir.
Actually, there's just one.
Okay, very good.
So Paul, thank you again for coming. My question is, how effective are wildfire mitigation efforts around structures like homes and cabins in the forest areas in protecting those structures in a wildfire?
It's extremely effective. I've really spent my career, whether with Vail or with Colorado State Forest Service, advocating and providing technical assistance to property owners to do defensible space. I can tell you from, protecting homes, that is what makes the difference. If you're waiting for a firefighter to remove vegetation to reduce that, when the fire is coming, it's not going to happen. There's not enough firefighters. There's not enough time, particularly if the fire starts close to the home. So it is absolutely critical for people to take those steps ahead of the fire to reduce the risk. There's a ton of great information out there, and there is an absolutely insane amount of resources available. Probably the biggest one that's available in your area is the Boulder Wildfire Partners, and those folks are awesome to work with.
Paul, my wife and I, Cassidy, we spend a third of the year up in Du Bois, Wyoming, which is an hour and a half east of Yellowstone. And there's a program up there where we have some forests. We're next to 2 million acres of Shoshone National Forest, but on ours is 5 acres. And where we have to thin out the forest so that each tree is so many feet from each other. I can't remember, it's like 10 feet or we haven't done it yet. That's next summer's project. But I'm just wondering if you could comment on that. How do you do some of that fire mitigation, especially if you have a forest on your property that you can, you have control over?
Yeah. I like to equate it to, how do you eat an elephant, right? Because in some cases it's a monumental task, but, one bite at a time. And what is most effective, if your care is protecting your home, is that closest to the house. So the house itself, and then working out from the foundation out into the forest, and, take it in reasonable, manageable bites. And, it's hard to say, is the fire going to happen, next week, next month, next year, or in 10 years. So, the only thing that I will definitely say is if it's the Western US, there is not an acre that isn't prone to wildfire. So there's definitely something that everybody can do. Certainly seeking out, technical advice and expertise is a great way to do it. Like I said, there's a ton of free resources, and, in most places, people that'll come out free of charge to, help you figure out exactly what you need to do.
Yeah, thank you. And we were very impressed with how welcoming and able to, the chief and the forest people, they'll just come out and they'll sit there and talk your ear off and give you all the pamphlets and stuff. But in case anybody's interested, here more locally in Boulder. So the next question is Rich Irvin. Rich, would you mind unmuting yourself and going ahead?
Okay. I grew up at a time when we always talked about Smokey the Bear, and about how Smokey the Bear, that was the big deal. I have seen for a long time, there's nothing about Smokey the Bear anymore. And is that because there's a need to have some fire to keep the things down so you don't have huge fires?
Yeah, so Smokey Bear is, one of the most recognizable icons, next to Mickey Mouse. And, Smokey's message has definitely changed over the last, 20 or 30 years. It was developed in a time when, all fire was bad. And that's one of the challenges now is, how do we how do we change the message to include that some fire is good and necessary for the ecosystem. And Smoky is still part of the the outreach of the U.S. Forest Service, but Smoky's message has definitely changed over the years.
Thank you. Meryl Glustrom has a question. Go ahead, Meryl.
Yeah, Paul, my wife and I and our family lived in Prescott, Arizona for a number of years. And as it turned out, our kids were in the same grades, same schools, because it's not that big a town, with the Prescott Hotshots. And as you know, that ended in tragedy with a fire in Arizona. And I wonder if you would comment on that fire and their involvement in it and the risk, as you mentioned earlier, of being a firefighter.
Yeah, the loss at on the Yarnell Hill fire with the Granite Mountain Hotshots was a pretty big hit to the firefighting community. Unfortunately, firefighting community is not without loss. One of the ones that we look at very regularly here is the South Canyon fire in Glenwood Springs in 1994, and the 14 firefighters that were lost there. In 2020, we lost 15 U.S. firefighters to wildland fires. And the way that we honor that is, we honor loss through learning, and that's a huge part of the training that we do. Is what can we learn from those tragedies? And fortunately, we've been able, as an organization of many agencies, been able to develop a pretty rich culture around learning from each other's incidents, near misses, and other things, so that we can avoid future incidents like that. Unfortunately, our numbers of loss of firefighters each year is somewhat flat, and it leads a lot of people in the industry to the question: is it possible to have a fire season without loss of life? And we have that mission, but there is a substantial amount of risk in the work that we do.
It seems to me that fire and their involvement in it, and that they were trapped by it, seems unavoidable. It's not like someone said, you shouldn't be in that area, it's too risky. It's just the fire did a strange turn, and then they were right in it. Their cards came up. But is there any lessons to be learned other than sometimes they're going to get you, the fires, especially as they burn hotter these days?
Yeah, the lessons really in that is that we operate in a very dynamic environment, and we have a set of standards that we utilize called the 10s and 18s, which is the standard firefighting orders and watch out situations. And really a lot of the things that were identified in that fire continue to be true. There's a lot of similarities from incident to incident, and really our biggest tool is what we call our situational awareness, which is the awareness of the environment around us, and which hopefully gives us the heads up so that we can react before it's too late. Firefighters become entrapped, and unfortunately situations like that occur.
Thank you.
So I'm sad that Jim's not here, because I gave him a hard time for asking 2 questions, but he really did have a bunch of good questions in the chat. So I'm going to read one of his questions. Why isn't there more of an aggressive replanting effort in burned areas to restore the devastated forests?
Yeah, that's a great question. And some of that is, there are some areas where it's not necessary. One of the things that occurs post fire is a burn area report, which is kind of a understanding of how, and this particularly happens on the large fires, but looking at how did the fire burn, where was those areas of severe damage, and really looking at it as a post fire risk. I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the post fire damage that's occurred in in the Boulder area, in the Colorado Springs area, after some of the major fires in 2012. And so, a lot of the focus is in how do we prevent, large scale watershed damage? And, the focus, because the cost, the difficulty, and honestly, the success of, planting in, post-burned areas are relatively low. So, it's trying to focus in on where your need is highest and where your chances of success are greatest. The other part of that is, since wildfire is part of the natural environment, the ecosystem has evolved to rebound after fire. And, when you look at, say, an aspen stand after it burns, you're going to see, hundreds of thousands of, new little suckers popping up. Oak brush does the same thing with that. Lodgepole pine has cones that stay closed until they burn. So, lodgepole pine tends to come back very strong after fire. So, especially when we talk about fires that are burning within kind of the way that we would expect them to normally burn, there may not be a whole lot of need to intervene with what nature does.
I have to tell you that I live here in the mountains of North Boulder, and in '09, it came, 3 sides of our house all the way up our mountain here or whatever. And by the spring, you wouldn't have known that there was a fire. I mean, it looked like the moon when we got back, because remember, it was something like it was in the winter, as I recall, the '09 fire. And you had all winter, there was all like the moon, but then it just grew back, and you never would have known there was ever a fire. So listen, I want to be very sensitive to your time, Paul. Before I open it up to the floor, do you need to go, or if someone has another question, do you still have time?
I have some time.
Okay, then I'm going to open it up to the floor. Does anybody have a question? If so, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, Mike, this is Susan, and can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Oh, good. So yeah, I have a question. My daughter lives out in California. Of course, that's another high fire area. And in particular, she went to Chico State University, which of course is right up the road from the Paradise fire. And I don't think I've seen anything more horrifying in my life of the people trying to get out of Paradise when there's only one road out, one road in. And I'm wondering whether evacuation is something that is looked at. Do we educate people that live in areas that have restricted numbers of ways to get out of the area? I mean, people died on those roads because they couldn't get out.
Yeah, evacuation is an incredibly huge part of wildfire planning. And, like a lot of, wildfire planning, there are some areas that do a ton of it. There are some areas that, do a little bit of it. But, I think it's a critical part of, of preparing any community for wildfires, understanding, just like you pointed out, the areas that have limited access, and egress, those areas that may get cut off with fire behavior. And, that's really where police and fire and emergency management, needs to be ahead of the game, because if you're trying to make that plan when the fire is burning, it's not going to be as well thought out as, if you do it before. One of the challenges in terms of educating community, a lot of people look to examples like hurricane evacuation planning as an example for wildfire. One of the challenges is that, there are 2 very different hazards, and so one of the challenges with wildfire evacuation planning is it may be different depending on where the fire is and, what the weather conditions look like for the day. So for some areas that only have one road, evacuation routes are pretty easy. You're going to, utilize the one road that you have, and, hopefully you can do some work to make sure that route is always open and available. But, in other areas where there's multiple routes where you're going to, move people, depending on fire conditions, then, it's a very complex world. And so, we focus our education significantly on educating our community on having a plan about, where they're going to go and what they're going to take. But also making sure that they are tied into our, notification system, especially, now that most people are going away from landlines, and, counties are utilizing these systems that require property owners to sign up for the notification system. If you don't know that an emergency is happening, it's hard to, particularly evacuate early. So, it is absolutely critical that people are tied in with those notification systems. So, while the situation, is going to dictate what the evacuation routes are, individual preparedness, should really all be the same.
Yeah.
I have a question, Paul. Is there effective anti-fire retardant that homeowners in the mountains should have available?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a number of products that are marketed. At the homeowner, there are paints that contain, fire retardant and that kind of stuff. And, my experience is that a lot of those kind of products that you apply on your house, whether it's the roof, the walls, the whatever, don't really have a lot of support, of effectiveness. There are also products like gels and foams that people can, utilize on, say, their vegetation. And one of the things that is becoming, increasingly popular is insurance companies offering, private fire service to protect the insured properties. And each year that becomes a bigger and bigger thing. Those insurance engines tend to utilize foams and gels, to cover vegetation. One of the challenges on that is that the longer they're applied ahead of the fire. So, say the fire may, arrive at your house tomorrow. If you put it on the vegetation now, the effectiveness decreases, every hour until the fire arrives. And so, we advocate that people get out far ahead and don't wait to, apply products like that. So, unfortunately, there's not a ton of great products out there, that can be applied. But, things like doing good vegetation management around the house and honestly, a lot of just really basic home maintenance stuff, making sure that leaves are raked, that your gutters are clean, that, there's not gaps and holes in your house. Those make tremendous differences in the survivability of your house to the point where it's not really necessary to put out things like gels and foams.
Thank you.
Okay, next question.
I have another question. I'm thinking of my daughter's boyfriend. He's a seasonal firefighter, as I mentioned before. He was stationed, I'm not exactly sure, maybe somewhere south of Grand Junction. Excuse me. And when Cameron Peak Fire came into existence, he was hoping that they would be called out to help. He wasn't until maybe toward the end of the summer, and then he was called up. So it just makes me wonder, how do they prioritize what teams they're going to ask to come and help out? Is it like
Sure.
local
So,
level, first, federal level, or yeah?
Yeah, so a lot of that depends on the individual agency's willingness to spare their resources from home, because particularly looking at this summer across all of Colorado, there was a relatively high risk of wildfire occurring kind of locally. And so if, for instance, a U.S. Forest Service district, so in our area, the White River National Forest has 2 fire engines, one located in Eagle County, one located in Summit County. Well, if they made that available for a fire, they would be committing that for likely 2 weeks. So for that 2-week period, that engine is not available to protect the local community. And so, throughout the season, each one of the local jurisdictions decides, whether they can or can't support sending their resources away. And, it's a very tough balancing act for sure. One of the things looking at moving resources around the nation is that there's a high emphasis to pull resources. Say this year in Colorado, we had a lot of the fire activity, but at the same time, so did Washington and Oregon. And so what their focus was to not pull any more resources out of Colorado, say, to go to Oregon and Washington, but to keep them in Colorado. But the other thing is that they were trying to bring resources from the East Coast and from Southern California, areas that were not having a whole lot of fire activity, to support those that did. But, you know, again, a lot of it comes down to, you know, what the local resources are willing to give up. There are a small number of resources, particularly aircraft and hotshot crews, that are what are called national resources. And so their availability is determined by that National Interagency Fire Center. So if a national resource is controlled, you know, from Boise, Idaho, they're going wherever they're told is the highest priority.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Okay. Any further questions before we let Paul get on with his day?
Thank you so much for being here, Paul.
Yeah, thanks for the
Paul.
extra time.
You bet.
This is wonderful.